That cannot be true, the senior examiner said, his voice carrying across the silent auditorium. No intelligent species has ever evolved to the top of its own food chain. Every conversation inside the grand hall of the Galactic Academy of Evolution stopped at once. More than 4,000 scientists representing over 200 civilizations turned toward the lone human standing beneath a ceiling filled with slowly rotating holographic constellations. Professor Benjamin Carter adjusted the microphone with the calm, practiced ease of someone who had spent decades speaking to classrooms instead of crowds. He was 58 years old, wearing a navy suit that looked ordinary compared to the shimmering robes and luminous uniforms surrounding him. A pair of reading glasses rested in his breast pocket, and a worn leather notebook sat beside a simple tablet on the podium. Nothing about him suggested he was about to challenge one of the oldest scientific assumptions in recorded galactic history. Benjamin glanced around the enormous chamber before offering a small smile. "I know how that sounds," he said. "Honestly, the first time I explained it to my own students back home, they thought I was joking too." A ripple of polite laughter moved through the audience, but it faded almost immediately. The Academy moderator leaned forward. "Professor Carter, for the record, are you confirming that the dominant sentient life form on your planet occupies the highest predatory position within its native ecosystem?" Benjamin nodded once. "Yes." The translation network paused for nearly 2 full seconds, searching for an alternative meaning that did not exist. It found none. Murmurs spread through the auditorium like a wave. Delegates exchanged confused looks. Several researchers immediately began typing into floating displays, while others quietly shook their heads. At the front row, Dr. Lyra Soreth, one of the galaxy's leading evolutionary biologists, folded her 4 slender arms across her chest. "That contradicts every verified model of sentient evolution," she said evenly. "Advanced intelligence develops because physically vulnerable species compensate through cooperation and technology. Apex predators never follow that path." Benjamin rested both hands on the podium. "That's true almost everywhere." He let the sentence hang for a moment. "Just not on Earth." A low chorus of disbelief echoed across the room. One delegate actually laughed out loud before realizing nobody else was joining in. Lyra activated the Academy display. Thousands of planetary classifications appeared behind Benjamin, each showing the same evolutionary pattern. Small prey species, defensive adaptations, social intelligence, civilization. "Every inhabited world follows this sequence," she said. "Every single one." Benjamin nodded again. "I spent 6 months reading your published research before I came here. Your data is excellent." He looked directly at her. "It just doesn't include my planet." Another wave of whispers swept through the audience. Benjamin reached into his notebook instead of touching the advanced holographic controls prepared for him. He pulled out an old printed photograph with slightly worn edges. A few nearby delegates leaned forward, fascinated by the primitive object itself. He held it up. "This is my grandfather," Benjamin said. "He grew up in Montana." The image showed an older man standing quietly beside an enormous brown bear at what appeared to be a safe distance inside a national park. Several alien observers immediately focused on the massive animal. "That predator outweighs your grandfather by at least 800 pounds, someone called from the upper balcony. Benjamin smiled softly. "It sure does." "Then why would your ancestor willingly stand there?" another voice asked. Benjamin looked at the photograph for a second before answering. "Because he understood something the bear didn't." Silence settled across the Academy once again. For the first time that morning, no one reached for a keyboard. No one interrupted. Thousands of scientists simply stared at the quiet man from Earth, suddenly realizing they might not be attending a lecture about another newly discovered species. They might be witnessing the first page of an entirely new chapter in the history of evolution. Dr. Lyra Soreth did not sit down. She slowly walked toward the center aisle until she stood only a few feet from Benjamin's podium, her silver academic robes brushing softly across the polished floor. She studied the old photograph in silence before looking back at the human. "Professor Carter," she said, her voice calm but unmistakably skeptical, "one isolated encounter with a large predator does not overturn 12,000 years of comparative evolutionary science." Benjamin nodded. "I agree." That answer caught her off guard. She had expected an argument. Instead, She found a man who sounded more like a teacher than someone trying to win a debate. Then explain it, she said. Benjamin carefully placed the photograph back into his notebook. You are assuming the relationship between humans and predators is based on strength. He glanced around the enormous auditorium. It never was. A display appeared behind him, showing hundreds of planetary evolutionary models collected from across known space. Every chart followed nearly the same pattern. Large predators ruled ecosystems. Smaller creatures survived through intelligence. Eventually, those intelligent species invented technology, built cities, and escaped nature altogether. Benjamin pointed toward the projection. Your models are correct. They just stopped too early. Several researchers frowned. One elderly delegate raised a hand. What do you mean, too early? Benjamin smiled. You assume civilization begins when intelligent creatures stop dealing with predators. He paused. Human civilization began while we were still surrounded by them. The room became noticeably quieter. Dr. Lyra touched her tablet, replacing the charts with a detailed reconstruction of Earth's prehistoric wildlife. Massive bears, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, giant crocodilians, enormous birds of prey. The list continued for several screens. She looked genuinely puzzled now. These species all occupied your world at the same time? Not every one of them together, Benjamin answered. But yes, our ancestors shared the planet with animals that could easily outrun us, overpower us, or outlast us. Another scientist leaned toward his microphone. Then your population must have remained hidden inside fortified shelters. Benjamin chuckled softly. I wish it had been that simple. A few humans in the audience smiled knowingly. Benjamin stepped away from the podium for the first time. Let me ask all of you a question. He folded his hands behind his back like an instructor walking through a classroom. How many of you grew up being taught to avoid dangerous wildlife? Nearly every alien hand remained lowered. Benjamin noticed the reaction immediately. Exactly. He pointed gently toward the audience. On Earth, children learn that before they even learn algebra. A few translators hesitated before converting the unfamiliar word. Benjamin continued. We teach kids what to do if they see a bear. What to do around snakes. Around mountain lions. Around sharks. Around wolves. We memorize those lessons because nature is not something we escaped. It is something we still live beside. Dr. Lyra slowly lowered her tablet. Your children receive predator survival education? Most of us do in one form or another, Benjamin replied. It depends where we grow up. A wave of quiet conversation spread through the hall. Several delegates began exchanging data with one another, comparing educational systems from their own civilizations. None contained anything remotely similar. Benjamin watched them for a moment before speaking again. The biggest misunderstanding about humans is that people think we conquered nature. He shook his head. No, nature keeps reminding us every single year that it deserves respect. He looked toward the enormous window overlooking the stars. We just never stopped learning how to live with it. No one interrupted this time. Even the Academy's recording drones hovered motionless, as though the silence itself had become part of the lecture. Dr. Lyra remained perfectly still for several seconds before looking back toward the massive evolutionary map floating above the auditorium. If your world truly functions the way you describe, she said quietly, then every predictive model we have ever trusted would fail the moment Earth is added. Benjamin gave a small nod. That is exactly what happened the first time we tried. A few curious voices immediately echoed through the audience. You modeled your own planet? Someone asked. Benjamin smiled. Of course. Scientists are curious everywhere. A faint laugh rolled through the room, easing the tension for only a moment. Benjamin touched his tablet, replacing the prehistoric wildlife display with a simple image of Earth seen from orbit. The blue ocean slowly rotated beneath scattered white clouds. From space, he said, our planet looks peaceful. Most visitors assume it is. He let the image linger before another layer appeared. Colored bands spread across the continents. Earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, wildfires, floods, blizzards, droughts, volcanic regions. The once peaceful image suddenly looked unpredictable. Several delegates leaned closer to their displays. Your world experiences all of these natural events every year, one researcher asked. Every single year, Benjamin replied. Sometimes several at once. Dr. Lyra narrowed her eyes. Then why establish permanent settlements in such unstable environments? Benjamin laughed softly, because eventually somebody looked around and said, "Well, this seems like a nice place to build a town." This time, even Dr. Lyra allowed herself the smallest smile. Benjamin continued walking slowly across the stage. "You have to understand something about humans. We have never waited for perfect conditions. If we did, we would still be living in caves." Another chart appeared behind him. It showed average environmental stability rankings across more than 8,000 inhabited worlds. Earth occupied a place so low that several delegates quietly assumed it was a display error. One technician even requested a system recalibration. The computer confirmed the numbers without hesitation. Murmurs spread once again. "Surely your civilization relocated to safer regions over time," another scientist suggested. Benjamin shook his head. "We tried." He pointed toward the rotating globe. "Then somebody discovered farmland near volcanoes, because volcanic soil grows incredible crops. Someone else realized rivers flooded, but also created fertile valleys. Coastal cities faced hurricanes, but they became major ports. We kept choosing opportunity even when nature charged us a price for it." The auditorium fell silent again. Many of the younger researchers exchanged puzzled looks. To them, civilization existed specifically to eliminate environmental uncertainty. Benjamin's explanation suggested humans had built civilization while accepting uncertainty as part of everyday life. Dr. Lyra finally asked the question that had been forming since the lecture began. "Professor Carter, were humans never afraid?" Benjamin looked genuinely surprised. "Afraid?" He smiled warmly. "Doctor, we are afraid all the time." Several alien delegates looked confused. Benjamin continued before anyone could interrupt. "Fear is not unusual on Earth. It is information." He pointed toward the image of the planet once more. "You respect the ocean because it is bigger than you. You respect the mountains because weather changes without asking permission. You respect wildlife because every animal behaves according to its own rules, not yours." He folded his arms comfortably. "Most of us do not wake up expecting the world to be safe. We wake up expecting it to be worth living in any way." No one typed a single note during the next several seconds. The hall had become almost unnaturally quiet. Then, from the highest observation balcony, a young graduate researcher slowly stood. His voice trembled with genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. "Professor Carter, if surviving your planet required adapting to all of that, then what kind of people does Earth produce?" Benjamin looked toward the young student, and for the first time since stepping onto the stage, his smile faded into something more thoughtful. "That," he said softly, "is the question the rest of today's lecture is really about." Benjamin let the question settle over the auditorium before answering. "Earth produces ordinary people," he said. "That is the part everyone gets wrong." A ripple of confusion spread through the audience. Dr. Lyra tilted her head. "Ordinary?" Benjamin nodded. "You are expecting every human to be fearless, exceptionally strong, or uniquely gifted. We are not. Most of us spend our mornings getting children ready for school, sitting in traffic, answering emails, paying bills, and wondering what we should make for dinner." A few delegates exchanged uncertain looks. That description sounded almost disappointingly normal. Benjamin noticed their reaction and smiled. "Exactly." He touched his tablet, and the towering holographic display behind him changed again. This time it showed no predators, no disasters, and no dramatic landscapes. Instead, dozens of ordinary photographs filled the screen. A construction worker wearing a dusty hard hat. A nurse smiling behind a surgical mask. A rancher repairing a fence beneath a wide Montana sky. A teacher standing beside a classroom full of children. A father teaching his daughter how to ride a bicycle. A park ranger helping tourists along a forest trail. "These people are not celebrities," Benjamin said. "They are not soldiers. They are not survival experts. They are simply living their lives." One young researcher raised a hand. "Then why are they relevant to evolutionary resilience?" Benjamin looked toward him. "Because every one of them understands something your models never considered." He enlarged the image of the park ranger. "This woman works in Yellowstone National Park." Another image appeared beside it, showing warning signs about wildlife safety. Every day she reminds visitors to respect animals that are larger, faster, and stronger than we are. The next image showed a lifeguard watching families along an ocean beach. This man spends his day protecting swimmers from changing currents that nobody can see from shore. Another photograph appeared. A family calmly preparing emergency supplies inside their garage. These people are getting ready for hurricane season. Benjamin looked around the room. None of these situations are extraordinary to us. They are simply part of growing up. Dr. Lyra slowly approached the display. Your citizens prepare for environmental uncertainty as a routine part of life. Yes, Benjamin answered. Not because we expect disaster every day, because eventually something unexpected always happens. A thoughtful silence followed. Benjamin folded his hands comfortably. When I was 10 years old, my father taught me something during a camping trip in Colorado. The auditorium became even quieter. I asked him why we carried bear spray, even though we had never seen a bear. Benjamin smiled at the memory. He looked at me and said, "You do not prepare because something will happen. You prepare because someday it might." Several delegates quietly repeated the sentence through their translators. Dr. Lyra lowered her eyes for a moment before looking back at Benjamin. That sounds less like survival training and more like a philosophy. Benjamin nodded. I think it becomes one after enough generations. He slowly walked back toward the podium. People often assume humanity became adaptable because we faced danger. I believe we became adaptable because every generation taught the next one what they had already learned. He rested one hand on the edge of the podium. Knowledge survived even when individuals did not have all the answers. Parents taught children. Teachers taught students. Neighbors helped neighbors. We kept passing lessons forward. The Academy Hall remained completely silent. For many of the delegates, the realization was beginning to take shape. Perhaps humanity had never depended on extraordinary individuals at all. Perhaps the true advantage of Earth was that ordinary people had spent thousands of years quietly teaching one another how to face an unpredictable world without expecting the world to change first. Dr. Lyra broke the silence first. Professor Carter, there is still one contradiction that remains unresolved. Benjamin looked up from his notebook. Only one. I feel like I am making progress. A wave of quiet laughter spread through the auditorium. Even Lyra allowed herself a brief smile before returning to her serious expression. If humans are not physically dominant, and if your survival depends on preparation rather than superior strength, then your position at the top of your ecosystem still requires an explanation. Benjamin nodded slowly. Fair question. He reached for the presentation controls, but instead of displaying another scientific chart, a short video appeared behind him. It showed an ordinary hiking trail winding through a pine forest somewhere in the Rocky Mountains. A family walked along the path carrying backpacks. Two parents, a teenage son, and a little girl no older than 8. The recording looked completely uneventful. Then the father quietly raised one hand. The family stopped immediately. Nobody panicked. Nobody shouted. They simply stood still. A few seconds later, a large black bear stepped out from the trees about 40 yards away. The animal paused, glanced toward the hikers, then continued crossing the trail before disappearing into the forest. The family waited another minute before calmly continuing their hike. The video ended. The hall remained silent. Finally, one delegate spoke. Why did they not run? Benjamin answered almost instantly. Because somebody taught them not to. Another scientist leaned toward his microphone. Why did the animal leave? Benjamin shrugged gently. Because most wild animals do not spend every moment looking for a fight. They are usually trying to avoid unnecessary risk too. Dr. Lyra looked genuinely surprised. Your people understand predator behavior well enough to predict its decisions? Not perfectly, Benjamin replied. Nature does not guarantee perfect outcomes. But we study patterns. We respect boundaries. We learn what works and what does not. He changed the screen again. This time dozens of photographs appeared. Wildlife biologists placing tracking collars on wolves. Marine researchers observing sharks from reinforced cages. Rangers monitoring mountain lions with remote cameras. Bird specialists quietly recording nesting eagles. These are not military operations, Benjamin explained. These are scientists, conservation officers, volunteers, and students. We have spent generations watching the animals that share our world because understanding them is always safer than fearing them blindly. One younger delegate raised a hand. Your civilization studies species capable of harming you. Simply to understand them better? Benjamin smiled. Curiosity has kept us alive almost as often as caution has. The answer triggered another wave of whispered conversations across the chamber. Dr. Lyra studied the images for several long moments before asking one final question. Professor, if your people understand these animals so well, do humans still consider themselves separate from nature? Benjamin looked toward the enormous image of Earth slowly turning above the stage. His expression softened. No, he said quietly. That might be the biggest misunderstanding of all. He folded his hands behind his back. We build cities. We launch satellites. We explore space. But every spring birds still migrate across our skies. Every autumn forests change color. Rivers flood. Seasons change. Oceans rise and fall. We do not stand outside nature pretending we control it. We are simply one more species that learned how to listen carefully enough to find its place. Thousands of scientists sat without speaking. They had arrived expecting to hear the story of an advanced civilization that defeated its planet. Instead, they were beginning to realize humanity had achieved something far stranger. It had become remarkably successful without ever forgetting that the natural world was never an enemy to conquer, but a teacher whose lessons were written over millions of years. The moderator looked around the auditorium before speaking for the first time in nearly 20 minutes. Professor Carter, the Academy has approved an unscheduled demonstration request. A faint wave of excitement spread through the audience. Benjamin raised an eyebrow. I was wondering when someone would ask. The enormous display behind him dissolved into the insignia of the Galactic Academy. A calm synthetic voice filled the chamber. Simulation Chamber 7 is now available. Dr. Lyra looked toward Benjamin. Would you be willing to participate? He smiled. As long as nobody expects me to wrestle anything. That earned the loudest laugh of the day. Moments later, the central platform transformed into a full sensory simulation environment. Towering trees appeared around Benjamin. Soft wind moved through digital branches. Birds called in the distance. The illusion was remarkably convincing. Several delegates leaned forward as environmental readings appeared above the scene. Oxygen concentration, humidity, temperature, visibility. This simulation is based on one of your national parks, Lyra explained. Our systems reconstructed it from public satellite records. Benjamin slowly turned in a circle, recognizing the landscape almost immediately. Not bad, he admitted. The pine trees are a little too perfect, though. Real forests are messier. More quiet laughter rolled through the audience. Then another figure appeared inside the simulation. It was a large herbivore native to an alien world, recreated from Academy databases. According to every known model, the animal possessed an extremely aggressive territorial response toward unfamiliar species. The simulation announced, subject released. The creature lifted its head and began walking toward Benjamin. Several delegates instinctively leaned back in their seats. Benjamin did not move. He watched the animal carefully, saying nothing. The audience waited. 5 seconds passed. 10. 15. The animal slowed. Benjamin quietly shifted 1 foot backward, making himself slightly smaller without turning away. He kept his hands relaxed at his sides. The creature stopped. It studied him for another moment before turning and wandering toward a nearby stream. The simulation ended automatically. Silence filled the hall. Finally, Dr. Lyra spoke. You identified the correct response without ever studying that species. Benjamin nodded. I studied behavior. She frowned. Explain. Benjamin returned to the podium. Animals communicate constantly. Most people simply forget to pay attention. He looked around the auditorium. Confidence, curiosity, fear, uncertainty. Those signals exist everywhere. Different species express them differently, but the patterns are surprisingly familiar. One researcher raised a hand. You recognize those patterns from body language alone? Partly, Benjamin answered. Posture, movement, distance, eye contact, speed. None of those belong to one planet. They are often signs that something is deciding whether you are a threat. Dr. Lyra replayed the simulation in slow motion. You stepped backward at precisely the moment its breathing changed. Benjamin smiled. Because it had already decided it did not want trouble. I just made the decision easier. A thoughtful murmur spread through the audience. Benjamin leaned comfortably against the podium. Humans spent hundreds of thousands of years sharing landscapes with animals that could not speak our language. If we wanted to survive, we learned to notice the little things. He paused before adding quietly, the funny part is, Those same skills turn out to work pretty well when dealing with people too. This time, even the senior professor smiled. Dr. Lyra looked across the enormous hall before closing her tablet. Perhaps our greatest mistake was believing intelligence separated a species from nature. Benjamin gently shook his head. Maybe intelligence simply gives you more ways to understand it. For the first time since the symposium had begun, no one in the academy seemed interested in proving the human wrong anymore. They had started asking a different question altogether. If humanity had learned these lessons simply by growing up on Earth, what else had that remarkable little world quietly been teaching its people all along? The symposium should have ended after the demonstration, but nobody moved toward the exits. The moderator glanced at the schedule hovering above the stage, sighed with a smile, and quietly canceled the next 3 presentations. I believe, he announced, the Academy would benefit more from continuing this discussion. A round of applause filled the chamber. Benjamin rubbed the back of his neck with an embarrassed grin. Well, now I feel bad for the next speakers. Laughter rolled through the audience again. Dr. Lyra stepped beside him instead of across from him for the first time that day. Professor Carter, she said, there is something I still cannot explain. Benjamin nodded. Go ahead. She projected another chart above the stage. It compared thousands of intelligent civilizations. One pattern remained nearly universal. As societies became more advanced, they gradually withdrew from untamed environments. Their cities expanded while wilderness steadily disappeared. Earth's graph was the only one that refused to follow the trend. Vast forests remained protected. National parks covered enormous areas. Wildlife reserves expanded instead of shrinking. Marine sanctuaries stretched across entire coastlines. You reached spaceflight, Lyra said. Yet you deliberately preserved habitats containing species capable of harming you. What? Benjamin looked at the image for several quiet seconds before answering. Because if we erased everything that challenged us, eventually we would forget who we were. The room fell silent again. Benjamin continued. My grandfather used to tell me that every generation borrows the planet from the next one. He was a rancher, not a scientist. But I think he understood ecology better than he realized. A student in the upper balcony raised a hand. You protect predators for future generations? Benjamin smiled. We protect entire ecosystems. Another display appeared behind him. Wolves returning to Yellowstone. Eagles nesting along rivers. Whales migrating through protected waters. Families hiking along forest trails. Schoolchildren planting trees. Volunteers cleaning beaches. Firefighters restoring damaged forests. Scientists tagging sea turtles before releasing them back into the ocean. These are ordinary weekends for millions of Americans, Benjamin explained. People volunteer because they believe healthy ecosystems matter even when there is no immediate reward. Dr. Lyra watched the images carefully. Your civilization competes with nature and protects it at the same time. Benjamin nodded. That sounds contradictory until you grow up there. He leaned against the podium. Most children on Earth eventually discover something simple. You can admire a mountain without trying to own it. You can respect a wolf without wanting one in your backyard. You can appreciate the ocean while understanding it deserves caution. One elderly professor slowly stood. His voice carried years of quiet experience. Professor Carter, are humans taught that they rule nature? Benjamin answered without hesitation. No. The old professor tilted his head. Then what are they taught? Benjamin looked around the enormous hall before speaking softly. That actions have consequences. He smiled as memories surfaced. Leave food where it does not belong, and wildlife changes its behavior. Pollute a river, and someone downstream pays for it. Ignore a forest long enough, and eventually fire reminds you it was always alive. Nature usually gives us plenty of warnings before it sends us lessons. Nobody interrupted. Even the translation systems seemed slower now, as though the words deserved extra care. Dr. Lyra quietly closed every chart on her display. I came here expecting to study an unusual species, she admitted. Instead, I have spent the day studying an unusual relationship. Benjamin nodded thoughtfully. That relationship is probably the most important thing about Earth. He looked toward the slowly rotating image of his home world above the auditorium. We never became successful by pretending we stood above the natural world. We became successful because, generation after generation, enough ordinary people remembered that we were always part of it. When the applause finally faded, the moderator walked to the center of the stage carrying a thin crystal data tablet reserved for only the rarest occasions. Even the veteran professors straightened in their seats. Dr. Lyra looked at the tablet and quietly inhaled. "Professor Carter," she said, "the Academy Council has reached a unanimous decision." Benjamin blinked. That was fast. A few amused smiles appeared around the room. The moderator nodded. Scientific consensus rarely changes in a single afternoon. Today appears to be an exception. The massive display behind them dissolved into the official Galactic Classification Archive. Millions of planetary records streamed across the screen before narrowing to one entry. Sol 3. Earth. The existing description slowly disappeared line by line. Delegates watched in complete silence as the Academy's central intelligence waited for new language. The moderator turned toward Benjamin. "Before we finalize this revision, we have one final question." Benjamin folded his hands and listened. Would humanity object to being categorized as an evolutionary anomaly? Benjamin smiled politely. "We probably would not call ourselves that." Quiet laughter drifted through the hall. "What would you call yourselves?" Benjamin thought for a moment before answering. "Normal." That answer drew even more confused expressions than anything he had said all day. Benjamin noticed immediately. "I mean normal from our perspective. Every species grows up believing its own home is ordinary. We climbed the same hills our parents climbed. We learned from the same seasons they did. We watched the same skies. To us, Earth is just home." Dr. Lyra lowered her eyes thoughtfully. "Perhaps that is exactly why we misunderstood your civilization." She stepped beside the moderator and addressed the assembly. "We believed intelligence evolved by escaping nature. Humanity demonstrates another possibility. Intelligence can also evolve by remaining deeply connected to it." Several senior professors nodded in quiet agreement. One after another, delegates began approving the revised classification from their personal consoles. Thousands of confirmation lights appeared throughout the auditorium until the entire chamber glowed with soft blue indicators. The Central Archive processed the vote. A calm synthetic voice echoed across the hall. "Revision accepted." The updated description appeared. "Homeworld classification, stable technological civilization." The words paused, then dissolved. New text replaced them. "Homeworld classification, adaptive apex sentient ecosystem. Planetary development model, continuous environmental integration. Educational status, required reference material for comparative evolutionary science." A low murmur swept through the audience. Benjamin looked at the screen, clearly surprised himself. "I was expecting maybe a footnote," he admitted. Dr. Lyra laughed quietly. "You eliminated 3 major theories before lunch. A footnote would not be enough." The room relaxed into warm applause once more. The young graduate student who had spoken earlier stood again. "Professor Carter," he asked, "does this mean every future biology student in the galaxy will study Earth?" Benjamin looked around the hall before answering. "I hope they study more than Earth." The student tilted his head. Benjamin smiled. "I hope they remember that every world has something worth teaching. Ours simply happened to teach resilience in a very unusual way." The moderator slowly closed the crystal tablet. "Then perhaps today's greatest discovery was not that humanity is different." Benjamin looked toward the slowly turning image of the blue planet suspended above the stage. "Maybe," he replied softly. "The greatest discovery is that nature has more than one way of creating intelligent life." For several quiet seconds nobody spoke. The symposium had begun as an attempt to explain one distant planet. It was ending with an entirely new understanding of evolution itself, and every scientist in the room knew they would never teach the old lessons in quite the same way again. The audience slowly began leaving their seats, but almost nobody headed for the exits. Small groups gathered beneath the towering holograms, continuing conversations that would probably last long after the symposium ended. Benjamin packed his notebook into his weathered leather briefcase, slipped his reading glasses into his jacket pocket, and quietly stepped away from the podium. Before he reached the hallway, he heard someone jogging to catch up. It was the young graduate student who had asked the final question. "Professor Carter?" Benjamin turned with an easy smile. "Do you have a minute?" "For a student?" "Always." The young researcher hesitated before speaking. "I spent my entire education believing intelligence meant escaping the natural world. Today you made it sound like wisdom means remembering where you came from. Benjamin stood quietly for a moment before answering. My mother was an elementary school teacher in Colorado. The student listened carefully. She used to tell her class that learning was not about proving you were smarter than everyone else. It was about noticing something today that you missed yesterday. Benjamin looked through the enormous observation window overlooking the stars. I think science works the same way. The student followed his gaze. Do humans still have things left to learn from Earth? Benjamin laughed softly. Every single day. He pointed toward the blue planet rotating on the distant display inside the auditorium. We still study forests because they surprise us. We still study oceans because we have not explored most of them. We still study animals because they keep teaching us new ways to solve old problems. We even study tiny insects because sometimes the smallest creatures discover solutions that engineers spend years trying to invent. The student was quiet for a long moment. I think I understand now. Benjamin smiled. Good. Explain it to me. The student took a slow breath. Your civilization did not become remarkable because humans believed they were above nature. Benjamin nodded encouragingly. Go on. You became remarkable because every generation stayed curious enough to keep learning from it. Benjamin's smile widened. Now you sound like a scientist. They both laughed. Across the hall, Dr. Lyra watched the conversation before walking over. She extended one of her slender hands. Professor Carter, thank you. Benjamin shook it warmly. For the invitation? She gently shook her head. For reminding us that the purpose of science is not to defend old ideas. It is to improve them. Benjamin looked around the academy one last time. Thousands of brilliant minds had arrived believing they already understood how intelligent life was supposed to evolve. They were leaving with better questions than they had brought. Somehow, that felt like the greatest success of the day. As he stepped toward the transport shuttle, his communicator chimed with a message from his granddaughter back on Earth. It contained nothing more than a photograph of her standing beside a giant redwood tree with the words, "Guess how tall this one is, Grandpa?" Benjamin smiled so broadly that one of the shuttle attendants noticed. Good news? The attendant asked. Benjamin slipped the communicator back into his pocket. The best kind, he replied. A kid asking questions. The shuttle doors closed as the academy slowly disappeared behind him. But inside the Great Hall, the revised planetary classification remained glowing on the central display. Future students would study the charts, the data, and the models, yet the lesson they remembered most would not be about one unusual world or one remarkable species. It would be the quiet realization that intelligence is not measured by how completely a civilization separates itself from the world that created it, but by how humbly it continues to learn from it. And somewhere beneath blue skies, between mountains, forests, deserts, oceans, and countless ordinary neighborhoods, life on Earth would continue exactly as it always had, reminding anyone willing to pay attention that the greatest strength a species can possess is not the power to stand above nature, but the wisdom to never stop listening to it.